Director Sir Mr. Srinivas R. Katikithala, Joint Director Ms. Radhika Rastogi, Course Coordinator Ms. Monica Dhami, esteemed faculty and course members, and all officer trainees present. I am Anmol Mittal, an officer trainee attending the 96th Foundation course at the Lal Bahadur Shastri National Academy of Administration. It is my privilege to introduce Mr. Tushar Mehta, Senior Advocate and the current Solicitor General of India. Mr. Mehta began his career as an advocate in 1987 and has won several gold medals from Gujarat University and the Gujarat Law Society. He was designated a senior advocate by the Gujarat High Court in 2007 at the young age of 41 and went on to become the Advocate General of Gujarat in 2008. He rose from there to become the Additional Solicitor General of India in 2017 and subsequently was appointed the Solicitor General of India in 2018. Mr. Mehta is no stranger to high-profile cases, having handled them right from his tenure in Gujarat till today. His practice is extremely versatile, ranging from civil and commercial matters, including international arbitrations on the one hand, to regularly appearing in sensitive criminal matters involving the CBI, the NIA on the other hand. He has also defended the government in several crucial constitutional cases, such as the challenge to the abrogation of Article 35A and 370 and the review of the Sabarimala judgment. His disarming style inside court and dignified responses outside of it demonstrate not only his legal acumen, but his humility and personal charm, all of which have contributed to his stupendous success. His interests outside the world of law lie in Urdu poetry and ghazals, with his personal library lined with collections of Mir Taki Mir and Ghalib. Having had the privilege of seeing him argue in open court during my internships, I'm confident that his address today will leave us all with a lot to think about and much the richer from having heard from him personally. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Tushar Mehta. So whatever you prefer. Oh, please, sir.
By force of habit, I am accustomed to speak while standing, so I'll be more comfortable. Good morning to all of you. My esteemed friend and one of the brilliant officer and one of the finest human being I know, Srinivas ji, Anandi ji, Monica ji, and all friends. Before I start with the discussion today, there is one caveat and one disclaimer. Caveat, I owe an apology to all of you because in such a beautiful morning, you will be required to listen to the boring subject of law, and it is rightly believed that the people who deal with law are equally boring. Second, as a lawyer, I am accustomed to address brilliant minds, 1, 2, maximum 9 judge bench I have addressed. I have never addressed such a number of brilliant minds in my life. So all of you are so learned. While preparing for civil services, you must have learned everything, including the Constitution of India. And today, I would look like a fool if I start discussing abstract concepts of custom and central excise and direct taxes. For you, what is relevant would be the Constitution of India, about which all of you already know. So the difficulty is, I know what I'm going to speak. I don't know whether I will be able to make it interesting. I'll try to. Friends, since I occupy a position and represent the government, it would be disastrous for me to enter into certain areas which are pending in the court of law, and therefore I would prefer not to touch them. But without touching them, let us undertake a joint journey as to how our constitution has developed. What is the constitutional history? And the history which you have been taught or you have learned yourself is not the history which I am going to speak about. There are certain common perceptions which every one of us as citizens carry. And one of the common perceptions doing rounds in recent times is defacing of the constitution by the majoritarian government. I put a caveat, I am not being political. I don't belong to any political party. None of you belong to any political party. But as educated and well-informed citizens of this country, before reaching to any conclusion, we must gather the details as to how the constitutional history developed and whether we can accuse a particular dispensation of any majoritarian brute force which results into defacing of the constitution. Let us start from the first. India became republic in the golden words of Nehru at the stroke of midnight hour. Everyone knows that was 15th of August, 1947. That's the thing which every one of us know. But legally speaking, how did we become independent? It was not as if Mahatma Gandhi said, you get out, Britishers went out, and we became independent. It can't happen that way. It has to have a legal succession from the British regime to the sovereignty of the nation. That happened under Indian Independence Act 1947. Under that act, India became an independent nation and we got rid of the British regime. Under Section 8 of the India Independence Act, there was a provision, now the provision has outlived, therefore I'm using the past tense, that there would be a constituent assembly which would frame the Constitution of India, and all of you are aware of that. Now, this assembly, constituent assembly, again, few of the brilliant minds of the country of the day, of the relevant point of time, most intellectual minds of the country. They started the deliberations on 9th of December 1947 and deliberated the constitutional provisions as to what should be the provision, what should be the framework which would be used by us to govern ourselves. See the difference. We were being ruled by Britishers. Now we had an option of being governed by ourselves. That took 3 years. There are two very important things which every one of us must remember. Prior to the independence, under the Indian Independence Act, India was being administered by the British under Government of India Act 1935. That was an act passed by the British Parliament. So was the Indian Independence Act, is an act passed by British Parliament. Under the Government of India Act 1935, the provisions of the act were almost similar to the present constitution with some minor major differences, but two striking differences. One, it did not have any chapter on the fundamental rights. Fundamental rights are basic intrinsic rights of each and every human being we reserve to ourselves. We as Indians ruled by Britishers did not have any fundamental rights. Second thing, and which is a less known fact, the Britishers have divided the nation into provinces, now what we call states. And there used to be elections taking place regularly, but interesting part, we didn't have the concept of adult universal franchise, meaning thereby every adult would have a right of vote. We didn't have under 1935 Act. Only two categories of Indians were permitted to vote: A, those who were taxpayers, and B, those who had certain qualifications, graduation or whatever may be the qualifications. There was no adult franchise. And the Constituent Assembly, which was constituted, was kind of a nominated committee, not elected by the people, and represented hardly 16% confidence of adult population who became entitled to vote after the Constitution came into force. Now, all these great minds labored together and came out with a great document called the Constitution of India, containing 395 articles. The immediate reaction was that of criticism. As any new venture receives, the Constitution also receives. I'll not go into the intricacies, but the criticism was in two parts. A, it's too lengthy, and B, it's too rigid. As a student of constitutional law, it is my firm belief that both criticisms were unfair. Long it is because the very width of the country, with diverse cultural, physical, geographical inhabitants with variety of reasons, were to be governed. And therefore, it had to provide for everything possible. Rigid it is not, and I will show how I come to the conclusion that it is not rigid. In fact, there was one member of the Constituent Assembly called Hanumantayya, a brilliant man, and his criticism was more fundamental. Of course, according to me, not correct and fair. The criticism was, in his words, I wanted to hear sitar and veena, but I ended up listening to a British band. But that was not to be. That was too premature for him to jump to that conclusion. Under the India Independence Act, there was another provision, and I'm trying to be less legal as possible so as not to bore you in the beautiful morning you are in. There was a provision that till the first election takes place, the Constituent Assembly so constituted would function as an interim parliament. So the Constituent Assembly started functioning as the interim parliament, and it continued to be an interim parliament till the first election took place in the year 1952. India became independent in 1947, but the first right of universal adult franchise was exercised by its citizens, and they elected its government in the year 1952. Now, please examine how the Constitution developed, how there were attacks on the Constitution, how there were attempts to deface and defile the very core ethos of the Constitution. It was the dream of Pandit Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, and a very good dream. It was a need of the hour to have agrarian reforms on a large scale. That was his proclaimed, professed dream, that we will have complete overhaul of the system, and we will have agrarian reforms. As a result, several laws came to be passed by the Constituent Assembly, which was functioning as interim parliament. Some state legislatures also passed land reform laws, which took away vested interest of big landholders, etc. All these laws came to be challenged before the respective high courts. There are 3 high courts which entertained the challenge and went deep into the validity of those agrarian laws: Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, and Uttar Pradesh. Madhya Pradesh was Madhya Bharat at that point of time, present-day Madhya Pradesh. Bihar High Court declared the Bihar Land Reforms Act unconstitutional, and the other 2 high courts they upheld the validity. Now, that was a dream-shattering moment for the first Prime Minister, because the country badly needed the agrarian reforms, and the first attempt was found to be facing legal challenges. And therefore, the first constitutional amendment came into force not by the elected parliament, but by the Constituent Assembly. They sought to protect the agrarian laws by putting them into a part of the Constitution and made them immune from any legal challenge, something which could never have been done and can never be imagined in the present circumstances. I must tell you before I proceed further that our constitutional framers went into the details, and as enlightened citizens, as brilliant minds of this country, I would strongly recommend you to read Constituent Assembly debates. They are recorded debates. They are available in 4 volumes, and you will find the genius of the people who framed the Constitution of India. They had before them Magna Carta, the British Constitution. They had before them American Constitution, the oldest constitution at that point of time, Swiss Constitution, Australian Constitution, and the latest was Japanese Constitution, which came into force in 1946, a year before our Constitution. In fact, one of the provisions in our Constitution is bodily lifted from the Japanese Constitution. But they never envisaged the situation that immediately and even before the government of the day is elected by adult universal franchise, we will have to amend the Constitution, and they did it. They did that. Now let us see, before I proceed further in the journey of how the constitutional development took place and which government took what stand to kind of amend the Constitution, which, depending upon the way we look at it, may amount to defacing the Constitution, destroying the constitutional values, etc. But that I will not be judgmental. I just leave it to you to make your own assessment. All of you are aware, the Constitution has several chapters, but for the present purpose, we are concerned with only 3 parts of the Constitution. First is the preamble. And there would be some relevance when I come to the constitutional history. Second is part 3 of the Constitution, which gives fundamental rights. When I say gives fundamental rights, is possibly a wrong usage, which the country, the citizens reserved for themselves. That this would be our basic rights, nobody can touch it. Third, chapter number 4, was Directive Principles of State Policy. Fundamental rights contained several provisions which protected our rights, your rights, my rights, etc. And they were enforceable. If somebody encroaches upon my right, I have a remedy of going before the court of law and get it enforced. As against that, directive principles of state policy is not enforceable. It is a broad guideline of the government to follow as to how they would govern. And please look at the choice of words. Earlier we used to be ruled. Now we are, after 47, being governed. And you will be the people who will govern. And therefore for you it's relevant. So part 4 provides for directive principles not to be enforced, but everyone will have to keep in mind, especially the government, especially the legislature, be it parliament or the state legislature, while formulating its policies, programs, or the enactments, that is statutory enactments. Now, most crucial part of the fundamental rights chapter, and I'm dealing a little into details because this would be relevant when I come to constitutional amendments and the fight between the executive and the judiciary prevented any encroachment on the fundamental rights. The judiciary prevented any majoritarian government imposing its will by sheer strength of numerical number, which attempts were made, brazenly made. The first article in part 12 concerns all of you, that is the definition of the word state. Because it is the state which has to respect and ensure that your fundamental rights are protected. But the state, as used in Article 12, the first article in Part 3, the Fundamental Rights chapter, is not the state as we understand colloquially. It's not the state government or the central government. It encompasses several, and it's an inclusive definition. It means it can be the executive, it can be the legislature, parliament, assembly both. It can be government corporations. It can be government officials. It can be banks. And you, my friends, when you will occupy your respective offices, whichever services you belong to, will be the state within the meaning of Article 12 of the Constitution. It would be your responsibility, a pious obligation under the Constitution, to protect my fundamental right as a citizen of the country. Keep that definition in mind for future reference. Next is Article 13. Article 13 defines law and says that any law which prohibits or infringes upon fundamental rights of the citizens would be void to that extent. And law under Article 13 does not mean law made by the parliament or law made by the state legislature. It is again an inclusive definition. It means rules framed by the government may not have gone to the parliament or the legislature, state legislature. It may include under certain circumstances bylaws. It can include under certain circumstances regulations framed by the board. But there is an over-inclusive definition of the word law. And please bear that definition in mind throughout, because something seriously would turn on that when the constitutional history commences further. Fourth article, the next article is Article 14, as you all of you know. Most important article, equality of treatment. Everyone is equal before the law and has the equal protection of laws. 15 and 16, again, facets of Article 14 only. 17 removes untouchability. 18, less used article, but that abolishes titles. There are no titles. Earlier, Rai Bahadur and Raj Bahadurs and the titles conferred by the British, abolished by one stroke. Except in military dispensation, there cannot be any titles. Some people by mistake use Padma Shri so-and-so. You cannot write that. You can write Mr. So-and-so within bracket Padma Shri awardee. There is no title. Then Article 19, the most crucial article, according to me as a student of constitutional law, I would say Article 19, 14, and 21 are the soul of the body which comprises Part 3 of the Constitution. 19 provided for 7 fundamental freedom. The freedom which we normally take for granted, the freedom which we normally tend to abuse without understanding our corresponding duties. But the first freedom, freedom of speech and expression, very widely worded freedom, and after the Constitution came, various judgments of the Supreme Court encompassing several facets within the meaning of freedom of speech and expression, including freedom of the press. Second, freedom to associate freely with everyone. Third, freedom to form any association or union. There cannot be any prohibition against my forming an association, my forming a union, in whatever name, under whatever circumstances, subject, of course, to reasonable restrictions. And all these freedoms are not absolute. They are subject to reasonable restrictions about which you know, and therefore I will not elaborate any further. Fourth, to freely move throughout the territory of India. Fifth, to reside in any part of the territory of India. Sixth, which is now no longer a fundamental right, the Janata government after emergency had removed it from the fundamental rights chapter, and it has gone as Article 300A, which is a constitutional right, not a fundamental right, but that was right to hold property. And the seventh most important right, right to do your business, trade, or profession without any interference. Then comes Article 20. You are aware, all of you must have read during your prelims, mains, etc. I'm not going to elaborate much, but Article 20 gives you a right not to be a witness against yourself and right against double jeopardy. You can't be punished or convicted or dealt with twice for the same action, and you can't be forced to be a witness against yourself. Then the most important article is Article 21. Only one line article bodily lifted from, I think, Article 47 of Japan Constitution. Right to life and personal liberty. And right to life and personal liberty has been expanded so much by the Supreme Court of India, which is the custodian of our fundamental rights, that it includes everything. Right to food is under Article 21. Right to decent environment is under Article 21. Now the latest judgment, 9-judge bench, which I said I addressed, right to privacy is also a fundamental right under Article 21. Then comes a separate heading, Article 25, 26, etc., that has religious freedoms. You know, you have read, I'm not going to dwell much into it. But everyone has a freedom to freely profess, propagate, and follow the religion of his choice. An extremely crucial article is Article 29, which is protection of your cultural rights, because India is a country with diversity. There are so many states where there are several cultural things which are obeyed more than the law itself. So law protects that. And the last, the most important right, and which I think is a unique position for India to have, Article 32. Article 32 means a fundamental right to directly approach the Supreme Court of India if any of the other fundamental rights are violated. There is no similar broadly worded provision in any constitution of the world. If your fundamental rights are violated right from Article 14 to 30, you can straight approach the Supreme Court of India and nobody can take away that right. So broadly speaking, Part 3 provides for the means, and at Part 4, Directive Principles of State Policy provides for the end. You employ the means to reach ideal goals provided for in the chapter 4, the directive principles of state policy. Now, everything was going very smoothly. Before that, let us just broadly the preamble. Preamble is a short, few lines document, but according to me, as a student of constitutional law again, it's the soul of the Constitution. You may not find that to be that relevant at this stage, but when you know the constitutional history and the development of law, you will realize that everything dependent upon the preamble of the Constitution. It starts, India is a sovereign democratic republic. Each word is pregnant with meaning. Sovereign, because we have got rid of British Raj. We were the sovereigns. Democratic, because for the first time, universal adult franchise was accepted as a very fundamental core of the Constitution. And republic, because it is very clear that we are not a monarchy, we are not even a semi-monarchy like Britain, and we are full-fledged republic, presidential form of government, Westminster model. You are aware of that. I am not dwelling much into it. Then the preamble proceeds further, says what is the goal of this Constitution? That is justice, not justice which courts administer, justice which you will administer as those who will govern us, the citizens of India. Justice, social, economic, and political. And mind you, while examining the challenge to any provision of law, including the constitutional amendment itself, because the Constitution itself came to be amended to suit the convenience of the government of the day. Constitution is ultimately a political document. Every word of this is used by the Supreme Court to protect my fundamental right as a citizen. Then it says liberty, equality, fraternity, and unity. Liberty, liberty of thought, liberty of expression, liberty to do whatever I want to within the bounds of law. Equality, equality of opportunity, equality of status. I am no less than somebody who is richer than me. Fraternity, the concept of secularism came subsequently, but the concept of secularism is in fraternity. Unless I love the person belonging to another religion and I have imbibed the concept of fraternity, there cannot be fulfillment of the constitutional goals. Now, this constitutional amendment came to protect the agrarian reforms. That was, as I said, was the constitutional amendment made by the Constituent Assembly. Of course, to fulfill the well-considered dream of Prime Minister Nehru, but as we found from the history, the route which they chose to protect was found to be completely unconstitutional and completely undemocratic. I have said fundamental rights not violable, not alienable, completely sacred, nobody can touch it. Directive principles of state policy cannot be enforced. What the first amendment did was they introduced Article 31A and said that when it comes to any law governing agrarian reforms, fundamental rights will have to give way to them. No fundamental right. Meaning thereby, if you take away my property arbitrarily, I can't claim Article 14. If you take away my property discriminatorily, my neighbor's property is not taken, my property is taken, this neighbor's property is not taken, there is an apparent discrimination, I can't approach the court of law. You take away my property without paying me compensation under the garb of agrarian law. I cannot approach the court of law saying that this violates my Article 14 rights. That was the first amendment. According to me, a draconian amendment. Second was 31B. A very interesting concept was introduced for the first time in the Constitution. You must have read that initial Constitution had 395 articles and 8 schedules. Now, in the first constitutional amendment, the government, the Constituent Assembly introduced Article 31B, whereby a new schedule was enacted, was incorporated, that is Schedule 9. And see the beauty of this amendment, and see the disastrous consequence if it would have been protected down the line. It said that whenever the parliament or the state legislature makes a law and puts it in the 9th schedule, it has an immunity from any challenge from any court. Neither the Supreme Court nor the High Court can examine the validity of that law which is introduced in the 9th schedule. And to be, to tell you at the outset, this amendment passed the muster of the Supreme Court. Thereafter, it was changed. But those were the days, and every thought process, every ideological upbringing of the judge, etc., is always influenced by the circumstances he is brought up with. This was challenged in Shankari Prasad Dev's case. I'm not going into the technicalities of it, but it's a 5-judge bench decision where for the first time they examined what is the meaning of the word law. Does the law mean only law made by the parliament, law made by the state legislature, or would it also include a law amending the Constitution itself? Because Constitution is the source of power to amend the Constitution. Can the stream rise above the source? That was broadly the question. And the 5-judge bench, by majority, said that Parliament can amend the Constitution of India. There was no concept of any basic structure, etc. It was a plain and simple argument that it's the Parliament. Parliament is supreme so far as lawmaking is concerned. Constitution is a law. I can amend the law. What's the problem? I have amended the law. 31A, you can't interfere. 31B, I have said that I have put it in 9th schedule. Otherwise also you can't interfere. In Shankari Prasad Dev's case, the 5 honorable judges of the Supreme Court upheld that constitutional validity which continued for 14 long years. That legal position continued for 14 long years. Now, since this continued for 14 long years, the government of the day, I'm not being political, government of the day, whichever was the government, found this to be very handy. So initially agrarian laws were being introduced in 9th schedule so as to make them immune from any challenge from the court of law. They started adding several laws passed in the 9th schedule, and list went up to almost 30 laws. Meaning thereby there were 30 odd laws which could not be challenged even if it affects my fundamental rights. Therefore, for the first time that question arose before the Constitution, let us revisit. And that happened in Sajjan Singh's case. I'm not giving you the citation, etc., because it's not necessary. You are not going to practice on this side. I'm just practice as a lawyer. But I'm just giving you a brief outline as to how the government of the day attempted amendments and how the judiciary reacted to protect the citizens. Government of the day, judiciary of the day. Now, this was again a 5-judge bench judgment, and the question, core question, I'm not going into, there are several questions answered in that judgment, but the core question was whether Constitution itself can be amended. and as to whether the law amending the Constitution would be a law within the meaning of Article 13 of the Constitution. Majority said yes, it can be. Majority of 3 by 2. There were two learned judges who were in minority and they recorded their dissent. One was Justice Hidayatullah, who eventually became the Vice President of India, one of the most brilliant judges the country had ever had. He became Chief Justice and thereafter became the Vice President of India. He said that while, by the way, before I proceed further, there is one important article, and bear that article in mind, that is Article 368, which gives power to amend the Constitution. So in this Sajjan Singh's case, the 5-judge bench, 3 by 2, upheld the power of the Parliament to amend, and Justice Hidayatullah said that no, I don't want to sit as a grammarian. I will not just look at the words, that power to amend, etc., etc. I'll go by the spirit of law. Letter of law may permit, but the spirit of law may perhaps not permit constitutional amendments so as to permit the stream rising above the source. Source is Constitution. You are a stream. You are created by the Constitution. You can't do something which destroys the Constitution itself. Second judge, again a most brilliant judge, Justice Mudholkar, who for the first time used the expression basic structure of the Constitution. But mind you, they were in minority. We have heard, we'll come to Keshavanand Bharati. But this could pass the muster of the majority, 3 by 2. Now, there is one detour I would like to take. The Supreme Court was struggling whether it will go by the Constitution as it existed or it can be amended. But in the process, the Supreme Court itself has amended Constitution many times by judicial pronouncements. And this is, of course, a subject matter of a separate debate, but I'll just give an illustration. As per the Constitution as framed, how the judges of the Supreme Court and the High Court were to be appointed, even today that provision exists as it is. The judges are to be appointed by the President of India in consultation with the Chief Justice of India. That's the letter of the law. The Supreme Court, which said that Constitution cannot be amended, cannot be defaced, said subsequently in the year 1982 that consultation is not enough. See, they didn't have the power to amend the Constitution. No court can amend the Constitution. They can only examine whether it can be amended or not. But the Supreme Court read into the word consultation the word concurrence. So unless and until the Chief Justice of India concurs, you can't appoint judges. The executive cannot appoint the judges. In 92, thereafter, it was further expanded. The Chief Justice doesn't mean only one individual sitting at the top of the hierarchy, but the collegium of first 5 judges for the Supreme Court and first 3 judges of the High Court. From where? From the judgments. The Supreme Court doesn't consider whether this needs a constitutional amendment because the Constitution has never been amended to provide for this. Anyway, we leave it at that. Justice Mudholkar said that Article 12 onwards, the Fundamental Right chapter, is so intrinsic, inviolable, and untouchable that you cannot have a constitution which tempers with the fundamental rights. This position again continued for some time, and the government of the day kept on adding more and more laws in the 9th chapter, making it completely immune from legal challenge. Now comes Golaknath case. It went before 11 honorable judges. Again, the most brilliant minds of the country sitting on the bench, and most brilliant minds of the country arguing the case. Ironically, one gentleman, a brilliant lawyer, a lawyer par excellence, Nani Palkhiwala, was instrumental in shaping this development of law. So I have some time, Srinivasji, some 15, 20 minutes. I'll not take long. Ironically, he was at Geneva defending the government of India in some case. We are not concerned with that case. When Golaknath was taken up, and it was found that Nani Palkhiwala would be the most suited counsel to address the 11-judge bench on this fundamental principle, whether you can amend the constitution in such a manner that it completely changes the very core, very heart and soul of the constitution. Palkhiwala was called only for a day. Incidentally, and these facts, some of the facts which I will be telling you, in books which you must have read in detail. The counsel arguing when Nani Palkhiwala came was one Mr. M.K. Nambiar, an eminent counsel of the constitutional law, incidentally, father of the present Attorney General for India, Mr. K.K. Venugopal. He was requested. This is a trivia, but very interesting trivia, that Nani Palkhiwala is coming only for a day. You are on your legs. Please do a favor. Please allow him to address the court for a day. Now, Mr. Nambiar being himself an eminent counsel, can't just get up and say that I would like my learned friend to argue. So he started his arguments. The court routinely put some questions, and he very graciously said that I'll need some time to prepare the answers to the questions you posed. In the meanwhile, let Mr. Palkhiwala address. And Mr. Palkhiwala addressed the 11 judges bench for a day. And I'm told, those who were present and we have read, brilliantly. Here, the decision was by a razor-thin margin of 6 versus 5. 6 judges holding in favor of Article 13 should include constitutional law, and therefore any amendment which is not in conformity with the Constitution goes. It's invalid, it's ultra vires, it's non-est. 5 honorable judges held otherwise. They continued with the original position that no, Parliament is supreme, it can amend the Constitution the way it wants. Now, before I see how the government of the day and the Parliament reacted to this, because the Supreme Court virtually protected the fundamental rights of citizens, and the Parliament was dominant by the brute numerical strength. But before that, Article 368, we must understand what it means. Article 368, as I said, provides for the provision for amendment of the Constitution itself. When this provision was being drafted, the founding fathers had 4 models before it, 4 possible models which they could have chosen from. 1, the Parliament by majority can amend the Constitution. That was the first option. Second, the Parliament may not touch anything, but let the state legislatures in the country decide to amend the Constitution, because then the electoral college would be wider, and therefore there would be more sanctity to the amendment which is made, because every assembly has applied its mind. Third, the utopian idea of the people amending the Constitution by referendum, etc. And fourth, any combination of these 3. But our founding fathers opted for a totally different model, and which proved to be the most fruitful model. The founding fathers said that in some cases, it would be the Parliament with 50% of the members present and voting with 2/3 majority can amend, and in some important areas like federal structure, judiciary being independent of the executive, etc., you need ratification by not less than 50% of the state assemblies. So very hard, very strict rule. Now, what the Parliament did. The moment Golaknath decided that constitutional amendment is also a part of law within the meaning of Article 13, and therefore cannot be amended so as to abrogate the fundamental rights itself, the Parliament immediately passed two constitutional amendments. This was somewhere in 1968, I think, 65 to 68, somewhere in between. The first was, it was 71, I'm sorry, it was 71. The first was Constitution 24th Amendment. You must have read, I'm sure you must have read, all our UPSC cleared brilliant minds, but I'm telling you the history in the context, that it was not just 24 being amended. It had a history, it had a context. It wanted to do away with the wisdom of the Supreme Court of India protecting the fundamental rights of the citizens. And therefore, 24th Amendment said, law in Article 13 would not include the Constitution of India. So Golaknath is dumped by legislative process. Second, they added Article 31C. See the beauty. See the intelligent way the mind works. They added Article 31C in the Fundamental Rights chapter and said that if the Parliament were to make any law, and please listen this carefully, if the Parliament were to make any law in the fulfillment of Article 39B, that is Directive Principles of State Policy, 39B of the Constitution of India, no court can judicially review the validity of such a law. So the only thing the Parliament was required to do was first say this is constitutional amendment, 24th Amendment makes it clear that it's not a law and therefore it can even violate the fundamental rights. In 71 this happened. And second, you make any law and say this is in fulfillment of our directive principles under Article 39B, and therefore the court cannot examine the validity of the challenge. Then 25th Amendment, again, it shielded some laws from the protection of fundamental rights, but that detail we need not go into. But 24th and 25th Amendment essentially were brought in by the government of the day to nullify the Golaknath judgment which protected our fundamental rights. When this 24th and 25th Amendment came, what now we have is the judgment of His Holiness, the Keshavanand Bharati case. All of you must have read, but please see the context in which this judgment arose. Keshavanand Bharati case had certain important events which are not reported in the books, etc. And therefore, I'll just share it. These are trivia, not relevant for any academic purpose, but interesting trivia. How the destiny plays its role in life of each one of us. Initially, Keshavanand Bharati, the landmark judgment placed before the 13-judge bench of the Supreme Court, was to be argued by M.C. Chagla. M.C. Chagla was a legendary Chief Justice of Bombay High Court. He retired as a Chief Justice of Bombay High Court after refusing to come to the Supreme Court, and thereafter became a minister in Nehru's cabinet. He was education minister and a legend of his day. There are very few people who become legend during their lifetimes. He was one of them. He was requested to lead the arguments in Keshavanand Bharati. He said, I'm too old and this is too heavy a burden. I won't be able to carry that burden. You ask Chandubai. Chandubai means C.K. Daftari, the legendary C.K. Daftari, the first Solicitor General of India, first Solicitor General of independent India, C.K. Daftari. By the way, C.K. Daftari was also the main prosecutor in Mahatma Gandhi murder trial, where Godse was ordered to be hanged. A brilliant mind. the lawyers went to him that, sir, please leave the arguments. Mr. Chagla is having some difficulty. He said, I am also unable to take this on. I'm too old and this is too heavy a burden. Let's request Nani Palkhiwala. And there comes Nani Palkhiwala. Both these old men, great men, brilliant lawyers, lawyers par excellence, requested Palkhiwala, and that is how Palkhiwala came into the picture. This is a destiny. And he argued for 32 days out of total hearing, which spread to 66 days. Another interesting trivia, just to see that this is not boring, but a very interesting trivia. When Nani Palkhiwala was arguing before a 13-judge bench, the judges, you visualize a position of the courtroom, 13 brilliant minds sitting on the bench, and one gentleman is arguing his matter about something which decides the very core of our fundamental rights. So each judge was constantly putting questions to him. And as a lawyer, you derail, your mind is not focused when you receive barrage of questions. You like to develop your point. And Palkhiwala was visibly feeling perturbed that I am unable to pitch my argument, to rephrase my submissions, etc. During recess time, he consulted C.K. Daftari. C.K. Daftari was known for his wit, his humor, and even today his wit and humor is anecdotal. He said, Chandubai, this is the problem, the judges are not allowing me to speak. Of course, judges were brilliant judges, and as any brilliant mind would have his own doubts, his own ideas, his own questions, so they were honestly asking questions. But who will say that these 13 people should keep quiet so that the lawyer can argue his case properly? Chandubai said, that Mr. C.K. Daftari said, I'll do something, don't worry, I'll handle it. After the lunch hours, he goes in the court and gets up. Mr. Palkhiwala was arguing, and Chandubai getting up amazed the court that, why, yes, Mr. Daftari, why are you here? He said, my lords, I never knew that this is a historical hearing. I came to know that this is really going to be a hearing which will go down in the history of India when I found some law students also sitting in the courtroom attentively listening. But I could not answer them. They had a question. The Chief Justice said, what question? He said, who is this gentleman standing alone and disturbing 13 judges when they are putting questions? The Chief Justice said, Mr. Daftari, we understood. We'll let Mr. Palkhiwala argue, will not interrupt. All questions would be after he completes his submissions. This is a trivia, but this is the intellectual level when you use the wit to say something which otherwise it's not capable of being said. So, first argument of Nani Palkhiwala, and I'll not try to be legal, but broadly trying to understand what was Keshwanand Bharati. He said that 368 essentially does not provide for any limitation. Any amendment can be made, it can even be destroyed. I mean, Constitution can be defiled also, why not? But considering the very width of the provision, you must read an implied limitation into the exercise of that power. See the beautiful argument, the nuanced argument, that the law does not provide for any limitation, but the law is so broad, law is so over-pervasive, that you will have to read an implied limitation into the power. Second limb of his argument was that even if you were to permit the parliament to amend the constitution, it cannot amend the constitution in such a way that it destroys the constitution, very fundamental values. And when those who were associated with the hearing tells us that when he was being briefed, all his lawyers who were briefing him, all the briefing lawyers, told him that, sir, there is no judgment in any court of the world where constitutional amendment is struck down. All courts are accepting the power of the concerned competent legislature to amend the constitution. So we have no precedent to rely upon. And the genius of Nani Palkhiwala was at its peak. And his style was to use simple words, to use short sentences, and give examples. He gave 3 examples. That, sir, I take it that Parliament has a power to amend the constitution the way it wants. But suppose the Parliament takes away Article 21, fundamental right, freedom of personal liberty. Freedom of life and personal liberty. Your life can be taken away except in accordance with law. Dehors the law. Your liberty can be taken away, dehors the law. Would you permit that? Second example is, which he gave was, that India is a sovereign democratic republic, as per the preamble, and therefore I refer to the preamble. Suppose some government comes with a brute numerical majority and decide that let us change this constitution and hand over the reins of this nation to, say, Mughals or Britishers. Would you permit? Judges were taken aback. The third example he gave, that right now the power to amend the constitution is with whom? The legislature, parliament. In some cases, the state legislatures will have to ratify. But suppose, by following this very process, the constitution is amended. To amend the constitution is given to the executive, the government of the day. That now henceforth, the cabinet will sit and decide whether to amend the constitution or not, and if yes, to what, in what manner. What will you do? That took the judges, that shook the judges. That no, we can't go along the lines we have been taking so far. The government of the day, government after government, has been challenging not us, but challenging the fundamental right of the citizen. And we have to rise to the occasion. Palkhiwala succeeded, not in his argument that you must read an implied limitation in Article 368, but the Supreme Court by majority held that basic structure of the Constitution cannot be amended. So see the beauty. The Constitution framed by the unelected Constituent Assembly, enjoying confidence of only 16% of the adult population, has made a constitution which cannot be amended so as to affect its basic structure even by the elected majority in the parliament, because it is a fundamental basic structure of the constitution. Again, interestingly, this was a decision taken by a razor-sharp majority, 7 versus 6. Justice Khanna had a pivotal role because he changed the minority into majority. He, of course, did not accept the doctrine. He accepted the doctrine of basic structure, but he says that Article 31C, which is introduced, which was under challenge, is valid. But that now doesn't occupy our time much because that has now gone. But Justice Sanjeev Khanna's single judgment changed the course of Keshavanand Bharati, and immediately thereafter came Mrs. Gandhi's election being challenged in Allahabad High Court. I'm using the name. I have avoided the names, and don't take it that it is a political speech, but it is necessary. Mrs. Gandhi's election was challenged before Allahabad High Court, and the elections in the country are held under the statutory law called Representation of People Act. You know about it. So challenge to any election goes before the High Court under the Representation of People Act. There is no constitutional provision for challenging any election of any elected person. It's under the Representation of People Act. The Allahabad High Court, one bold judge, declared the election to be void. She was found guilty of certain malpractices. The Prime Minister of the country, the sitting Prime Minister of the country, the most powerful Prime Minister of the country of the day, was unseated by a judicial verdict given by one single judge of Allahabad High Court. And look at the way government and the parliament of the day responded to this. They brought 39th constitutional amendment, and there cannot be more draconian law than what was brought under 39th amendment. They said two things. They said, if the election of two individuals, namely the Prime Minister of the country and the Speaker of the Lok Sabha, is set aside by any High Court, it will not be given effect to till we make a law, which is yet to be made. It was not a law made. And till it is examined by the Supreme Court of India as per the law which we will now come with. So Supreme Court was virtually left with no option. If the High Court set aside the election of a Prime Minister or Speaker, because of 39th Amendment, it will have to go to the Supreme Court. The government was to bring law, and if the government says Supreme Court should set aside only on A and B grounds, Supreme Court can do only that, nothing further. Virtual immunity from elections being challenged. Completely undemocratic, completely draconian, Hitlerian, as some of the constitutional jurists use the expression. Now again, this went before 5 judges. Whether this can be done, and the interesting part, again a trivia, which possibly you may not read, because you will be reading the amendment part only without the context. Even if it is with the context, these interesting facts, which doesn't turn the matter on merits, but they are interesting facts. Out of the 5 judges which decided this against Mrs. Gandhi, 5 judges of the Honorable Supreme Court which decided the validity of 39th Amendment against Mrs. Gandhi, 4 were minority judges in Keshwanand Bharati. They said that no, basic structure also can be altered. When they came out, when they came face to face with such a draconian amendment, which Nani Palkhiwala has professed, they were also shocked. And therefore, Chief Justice Ray, they set aside 39th Amendment for different reasons. And I'll give one-line reason only. I'll not going into the intricacies of law, which they discuss brilliantly. Chief Justice Ray said, if we do not interfere and set aside 39th Amendment, that would mean there is no rule of law. And rule of law is a basic feature of the Constitution, and therefore it cannot be taken away. We set aside the amendment. The second judge, Justice Matthew, remember the name. There is something more trivial, but very interesting. Justice Matthew. Justice Matthew says that election being fought, contested, won, and decided is a part of the democratic process, which is a part of the preamble. Can't be tinkered with, and therefore I set aside. Justice Matthew. Third judge, Justice Khanna, again set aside on the ground that this violates free and fair elections. You can't have fetters on the Constitutional Court's power of deciding the validity. And fourth, Justice Chandrachud. He said this violates the equality clause. Why do you separate and separately treat Prime Minister and the Speaker? Why? What is the trivia? Out of these 4 judges, 3 of them incidentally have their representation today also in the Supreme Court. Justice Matthew's son, Justice K.M. Joseph, is on the bench. Justice Khanna, his real nephew, Justice Sanjeev Khanna, is on the bench and slated to be the Chief Justice after 4-5 years. and Justice Chandrachud, who retired as the longest serving Chief Justice of India, his son, Justice D.Y. Chandrachud, is also on the bench, and next to next, the Chief Justice of India. This has nothing to do with the judgment, but this is just a trivia, an interesting trivia. But now see the abuse or misuse of power. Just 10 days after this judgment was delivered by the 5-judge bench, there comes 41st constitutional amendment. It was an amending act. It was not passed. It said that if there is any criminal action taken against the President, Prime Minister, or Governor, you cannot take any action for his lifetime. So Prime Minister, President, and Governor completely immune. And mind you, there is no prescribed tenure of the governor. You can be a governor for a day. You must have, you may have heard Humayun, when he lost battle against Sher Shah Suri, Battle of Chorsa, and he was drowning in the river. One Bhishti means the water carrier, he rescued him. He removed his bag and took the emperor on his shoulder, and he was survived. And the emperor promised him that I'll make you the emperor of India for a day. And he was made emperor of India for a day. There was a Bhishti who was emperor of India for a day. It can happen to governor. The moment you are appointed as a governor for a day, you do whatever you like, the law will not be able to catch you. That was 41st Amendment. Now, they realized, the judges realized that Keshwanand Bharati is sought to be overruled. And suddenly came the 42nd constitutional amendment brought by Mrs. Gandhi. And what was 42nd? And I'm at the end of this journey. Kindly bear with me for a few more minutes. What was that 42nd amendment? The government of the day felt that now let us not have any confusion at all. They amended 368 itself. They added 2 articles. 368(4), which says that once the constitutional amendment is passed, no court can examine the validity. Nasti mula kuto shakha. There is no root. So where is the question of any branches being examined? You have no power. You are out. And second, that 368 power of amendment is unlimited. There are no fetters. So out go Keshwanand Bharati principles. Meaning thereby, you can even change the basic structure of the constitution. They also added one more article, which was set aside by the 11 judges, 31C. And this remained unchallenged. See the history. 41st Amendment and 42nd Amendment brought by Mrs. Gandhi brought her down. For various reasons, she imposed emergency, etc., etc., and the history is known to every one of us. And she was unseated by the people of India, and the Janta government came. But the Janta government came with such a thin majority that it could do nothing to undo this 41st and 42nd Amendment. So though they were in power for 2 years, they have promised the people that will remove these 2 draconian laws. They could do nothing because they didn't have the majority in the parliament. At that time, Palkhiwala was the High Commissioner to United States. And he publicly promised that the moment I demit my office and come back to practice, I will challenge this constitutional amendment and I'll ensure that what Parliament could not do legislatively, I'll request the judges to do judicially. His tenure as a High Commissioner was over. He came back. Now, he was in search of a case where he can argue this, because it was 2 years old law and everything was settled. He found out one judgment, which was Minerva Mill case. It was an act passed under old 31C, having the protection because of the protection granted under 31C, that it refers to the directive principles of state policy. So he found out the lawyer who filed that case and said that, come, I'll argue this case. In good faith, in the interest of the Constitution, to protect the democracy. And again, the matter went before 13 honorable judges. And one interesting trivia, again. One of the judges there was Justice Untwalia, a brilliant judge, who has delivered landmark judgments, which are good law even till today. But he had a socialist bent of mind. And he was obsessed with the principles of socialism, with which nobody can have any quarrel. You can be obsessed with anything. So when Palkhiwala was arguing, he kept on repeating that, Mr. Palkhiwala, all this theory, basic structure, etc., implied power, implied limitation to be read, etc., everything is over, is okay, we'll examine. What about the socialism? And then he started delivering lecture on his views on socialism. And I'm told by many senior lawyers who were present, the Palkhiwala, whenever he used to be perturbed, he would do like this. He was looking at the judge. He was a very polite man. After the judge took a breath, he says, has your lordships finished? Justice Untwalia said, yes, we have finished. Then he said, not even a lunatic. And there was a stunned silence that what Palkhiwala is saying would think of jumping Berlin Wall from west to east. I think that answers your question. And they struck down the constitutional provision. Friends, this is the history of the way our constitution is attempted to be defiled. Please understand the beauty of our constitution, and as administrators, you will have to keep this in mind, that we are the proud inheritors of the ancestors who have given us this beautiful constitution with inbuilt checks and balances. Who is the king? I am the king. You are the king. The citizen is the king. Have you ever examined why Pakistan couldn't survive democracy for long? There is a clear answer under the constitution. In India, we do not have a chief of all three defense forces, and therefore army mutiny is ruled out by the constitutional framers. Who is the chief commander of armed forces? The President of India. What is he supposed to do? Act as per the aid and advice of the cabinet. What is the cabinet? Cabinet is the group of ministers which must owe allegiance and confidence of the House. House is made of elected representatives elected by me and you. So we are the real sovereigns. Therefore, India has successfully survived democracy and successfully survived any attack, even remotely made by the government of the day, to disturb this democratic fabric running throughout the constitution. And I must say, since I'm associated with the government, now you examine as intelligent and brilliant minds what were the constitutional amendments made after 2014. It's not a political statement, it's just an examination of the history of constitution from the standpoint of a constitutional student of the Indian Constitution. There are very few amendments without even remotely touching the fundamental rights of any citizen. There has been a debate since long, 10, 15 years before, that this system of appointment of judges needs something more to be desired. As Arun Jaitley very aptly put it then, judges appointing judges through the collegium system is like members of a club enrolling other members into their club. That must stop. And there was a political unanimity on this. The government came out with a constitutional amendment, that is National Judicial Appointment Bill. And all political parties across political spectrum were unanimously for that act. It was not one party opposing other party. Every state government ratified it. The parliament passed with thumping majority. It went before a 5-judge bench. Since I appeared, I will not comment upon the judgment, but that constitutional amendment was set aside 4-1, 4 versus 1, on the ground that independence of judiciary is a part of basic structure of the constitution which they had created, and therefore any interference by the executive, even in the decision-making process of selection of judges, violates the basic structure, and out goes the law made unanimously by all political parties, by following the procedure established under the Constitution. Friends, my only request is, you will be going all over the country. You will be the state within the meaning of Article 12. You will be protecting the fundamental rights. You will be interacting with a layman, an intelligent professor, an illiterate sabjiwala also if he comes with a problem. You must be clear about the history of the Constitution if somebody were to tell you that recently the Constitution is under a threat because of the majoritarian government. And the history which I have shown with judgments shows otherwise. There has been no tinkering with any of the fundamental rights. They remain sacrosanct, even if some of the fundamental rights are abused. Freedom of speech and expression, the most abused fundamental right. We have a right to speak, but we have no intelligence to know what not to speak. We must understand that your right to move your fist must end when my nose begins. But we take our rights for granted, and as the Honorable Prime Minister says, please take duties equally seriously. We would be remembering by number Article 13, 14, 15, 21, everyone, even a layman knows. But even an educated man doesn't know about the fundamental duties, which is very much a part of the Constitution. Friends, this torture is enough. I am really grateful. You have been very magnanimous. I know the subject is boring. I know, because I have no other option. That's my subject. As during the introduction, it was said that my interest is in Urdu ghazals, etc. But this is a function of senior bureaucrats, future bureaucrats, and not a mushaira. Therefore, I can't be more interesting than this. I'm really grateful to my friend Srinivas ji, and indeed grateful to all of you for tolerating me all this while. Thank you so much.
Please invite Director Sir Mr. Srinivas R. Katikithala and Joint Director Ma'am to please come up and present the memento of our gratitude to Mr. Mehta.
Yes, he was bold.